it's Haley, and today is the final day of Bookmas. Oh my goodness, and it's also the final day of 2019 and the final day of the decade. Wow, a lot to process here. But today we are going to be talking about my top books of the decade. So yesterday I was a little bit negative, and by a little bit I mean quite a bit, because I was talking about the worst books of the decade, or my least favorite books that I have read in the past 10 years, but now we are going to be talking about the best. And this list was incredibly hard to narrow down. There's quite a few that I wanted to include, but I didn't want this video to be ages long, and as it is, I have a list of nearly 20 books. I just have so many books that I've read in this past decade that I have loved and I cherish and hold so near and dear to my heart. But if there's a book that you hear me talking about a lot and it's not on this list, it doesn't mean I don't love it. It just means that this was a very competitive list and it didn't quite make it. So like I said in yesterday's video, I only started getting into reading at around 2011, 2012, so this list starts then, and I do actually have quite a few books from then because I read some really great books that introduced me to my love of reading. But the majority of my reading has been over the past 5 years since I started my channel. I will be telling you the year that I read all of these books, and some of them are guesstimates, some of them I know for sure, but I tried my best. I do have a lot of books to talk about, so I'm going to try and be as quick as I possibly can. Also, Happy New Year's Eve. Wow, I suck, but Happy New Year's Eve. And finally, before I get into this list, it is in no particular order because it would be impossible to order all of these books. As it was hard to narrow it down, so ordering them would just be, no, it wasn't gonna happen. So let's get into it. First up is The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This was my favorite book that I read in 2018 for good reason. It is an incredible story about sisters in World War II. They are living in Nazi-occupied France, and you follow the story of them in the present and in the past when that was happening, and it's such an emotional and impactful story. It was very memorable and just made me think, and the characters definitely nestled their way into my heart, and I just I can't. This book is so near and dear to me. I absolutely loved it and fell in love with it, and I highly recommend that you listen to the audiobook. I do have a link down below for Audible. If you sign up for a free trial, you can get 2 free audiobooks, so definitely check that out, and I highly recommend that you make this one of them. If you like World War II historical fiction and stories that are probably going to make you cry, chances are you will love this one. It was so hyped up. I thought there was no way I was going to live up to it, but it exceeded my expectations, so definitely check it out. Next is my favorite book of 2019. You guys have heard me talk about this book quite a bit, so I'm going to be brief about it, but that is Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. It tells the story of Daisy Jones, who teams up with the band The Six, and it tells the story of their rise to fame and then their downfall as they break up at the height of their fame. It's set in the 1970s rock and roll scene, so you get the sex, drugs, rock and roll, all of that stuff, and it's just incredibly realistic. Once again, a book that I recommend the audiobook for, but especially this one because it is told in an interview format, and the audiobook was cast by the author, so all of the voice actors are perfect for the roles that they play, and it just creates this epic, documentary style story where you feel like it's real, and when you finish it you're like, how could this not actually be real? This is probably my favorite audiobook that I have ever listened to. I even listened to it twice this year, so that's saying a lot. Next is The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Lavender by Leslye Walton. I read this in 2015, and I believe it was my favorite book that I read in the year. I don't quite remember, but I'm pretty sure it was. But this is about a girl who was born with wings, so it's a magical realism story, and it is beautifully written and just so whimsical. It pulled me into this world, and you follow the different generations of females in this family leading up to Ava's birth, and you kind of don't really learn more about the whimsy of it. It's very bizarre, but it is beautiful and just so good. I love this book a lot, and I actually feel like I want to reread it soon because it's been a while. Next is, of course, I feel like I should have started with this book, but Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Believe it or not, the first time that I read these books was this decade. I read them in 2013 for class, and then I made it my mission for every year of university I would take a class where they taught this book, because there was always one, and I succeeded with that mission. So this is obviously one of my favorite books of all time. It is the namesake of my channel. It is just everything. I love the story of Alice so much. I love the whimsy of it and the fact that it takes me to this world of nonsense where things don't make sense, and that's okay because that's how it's supposed to be. There's just something so comforting about the story that I truly, truly love it. And I'm sure that I was probably exposed to the story before then, but this is my first memory is in 2013 of reading this for class and just absolutely falling in love. Next is The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. I read this in 2012, and it is one of the books that I credit with introducing me to the world of reading. I fell in love with this tragic love story about these two teenagers with cancer, and the writing and the love story that John Green is able to build up just made me fall in love with all of it. Honestly, every John Green book that I have read could be on this list. I love him as an author. He's one of my favorites. Looking for Alaska, once again, an angsty love story that I completely fell head over heels in love with, and Turtles All the Way Down was also so good. Very different than the other books of his that I love, but still an amazing story that I think had a very good and close to home representation of mental illness. So John Green in general is kind of an author of the decade for me. Next is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. I read this in 2016 because I had heard so much about it. I'd heard amazing things, and I had read the Grisha trilogy, but this seemed to be getting a lot more buzz. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a chance. And wow, did I ever fall in love with this ragtag group of characters who are going on this heist. It was just everything I wanted. A high stakes fantasy and this amazingly intricate world, and just the characters, everything about them. I felt like they were real people that I came to care about and wanted the best for them, but also knew that like not all of them are going to be successful in their mission. And just, oh my goodness, this hit me right in the feels, but it was also so good and kept me on the edge of my seat the entire time. It was just an amazing duology. Next is Heartless by Marissa Meyer. This is an Alice in Wonderland retelling that I read in 2016, and I think it is my favorite Alice in Wonderland retelling of all time, which is saying a lot because I have read quite a few of them, but this is a villain backstory for the Queen of Hearts, and you see how she became who she is in the original Alice story, and I just thought that was fascinating, giving substance to such an iconic villain and the baking element. And I think that Marissa Meyer did a fantastic job of representing Wonderland and making it her own, but also staying true to Lewis Carroll's original story. It was whimsical, magical, and everything I wanted. Oh, it was just so nice to be back in Wonderland, but with a completely new story and learning more about that character. Next is A List of Cages by Robin Rowe. This is a very heartbreaking story. I read it back in 2017, and I wasn't expecting it to be as impactful as it was. So it's really a story about brotherhood. It's about these two characters, these two boys who they knew each other when they were younger, and then the older boy is a senior and he ends up reconnecting with the other boy as a freshman and taking him under his wing, but he realizes that this boy is going through a lot and is suffering from abuse. So be aware that there are multiple trigger warnings associated with this story. I think it was a very powerful account of abuse that opened my eyes and kind of scarred me for life, but not in a bad way. It just made me more aware of the issue, which I'm glad for. I think it was a very powerful, well-written, poignant account of abuse and how it can affect a child. Next is The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. This is another pretty intense and poignant story. So I read this in 2018 and it was one of my favorites of the year. It follows Leigh, who is grieving the loss of her mother who has killed herself, and she believes her mother has turned into a bird and that she is telling her to travel to Taiwan to meet the grandparents that she never met. So Leigh ends up going there and learning more about the culture she never really got to know and learning to accept what has happened to her mother. I think this is one of the best accounts of mental illness that I have ever read personally. I think it really rang true to my own experiences, and it's a story that meant a lot to me. It wasn't a very fast-paced story at all, but I felt like it was beautiful and it did exactly what it needed to do, and I loved it. Next is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. This is another author that could be on my favorites of the decade list because I also really loved Between Shades of Grey by her. I haven't gotten the chance to read her most recent novel yet, but I'm very excited to get to it. But this tells the story of the tail end of World War II, where we follow three different characters who are all fleeing to try and get on this ship and get away from Germany. I feel like a lot of the books that I have to talk about on this list are really sad. Not all of them, but it's just like the historical fictions and stuff. I don't know. I like sad books, I guess. They stick with me because they're just very powerful. So this book was no exception. It's extremely sad. It tells the story of one of the worst maritime disasters in history that I didn't even know about, which is very sad in itself. I love the fact that you followed all of these different characters who each came from different backgrounds, but their stories were pretty similar because of the time period. And I just think it was a great account of what happened, and it opened my eyes to something I didn't even know about. Next is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I read this in 2017. It came out and everyone was talking about it, and I was like, well, I need to know what this book is about, and it definitely did not disappoint. In the story, we follow Star, who is the only witness to her best friend being killed when he was unarmed at the hands of a police officer. So it deals with important issues such as racial profiling, police brutality, and things like that that definitely need to be discussed, and I like the fact that this brings it to a teen audience. It's definitely an intense story, but entirely worth the read. Next is, once again, a really sad story, but that is Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein. This follows the story of a pilot who has crashed in Nazi-occupied France. So they were operating a British spy plane and they end up being taken by the Gestapo, and they are in interrogation, and that is the setting of the story. It flips between the past and the present as the story is coming together, and it's kind of like a puzzle that's coming together over the course of the novel, and it's another one that I love the audiobook for. And I also really loved Rose, what was it? Rose Under Fire, I think is the sequel. But nonetheless, I loved both of these stories. It's kind of a companion duology, and I definitely recommend it. Also, I read this back in 2015. I'm pretty sure this is the last sad book on this list. So next is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. Yes, another book. How did I read this decade? Like what? I don't actually know when it came out. Did it come out in this decade? I have no clue. No, 2005. So maybe I didn't read it this decade, but I think I did. Either way, we're going to talk about it because we're here already. So I think I read this for the first time back in 2012 or 2013. I'm not entirely sure, but it is a historical fiction set at the time of World War II, and it follows this little girl who is living with this older couple, and it's the story of her that is narrated by death. So it's obviously very sad, but it is incredibly well done. A beautifully crafted story. I think there was thought that went into every part of it, and it just means so much to me. This is one of my absolute favorite books of all time, next to Alice in Wonderland. Those are like my top two. I know it's a story that I will never forget, and I will continue to sob every time I reread it, and even thinking about it, it gives me chills. I just love it so much. Next is Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. I read this back in 2014, and it was kind of the perfect time to read it. I was in my first year of university, and the main character is a freshman in college, and Kath, she is learning to live without her twin and be kind of separate from her, but she's also trying to figure out what she wants to do with her life and adjust to college life. And there's also a great romance, and it's all about fan culture as well. So definitely a very relatable story, super fun, and one that I just truly love. Next is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. This is definitely a story that I was exposed to when I was younger, but I don't think I ever actually read the book until I had to for my Canadian literature course in my second year of university, so I read it back in 2015. This is such a Canadian classic, and I have such nostalgia attached to it because I used to watch all the Avonlea things and all of that as a kid with my mom, and I didn't like it then, but reading it for the first time, I fell in love with the imagination of Anne, and it just brought me back to being a kid again. And Gilbert, of course. Oh my goodness, Gilbert. Like, Gilbert is the ultimate, I mean, he's a kid, so I feel weird saying it, but he's so cute and just so perfect and everything you want in a boy. This is definitely a favorite of all time for me, and this edition is also beautiful. Speaking of that edition, next is A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is another story that I know I was exposed to in my youth. I know I watched the movie all the time and I loved the movie, so when I decided to pick up the book for the first time, and that was back in 2016, so not that long ago actually, but I fell in love with it all over again. These are all just books that I'm in love with, is what we're getting here. But once again, that nostalgia really brought me back to the story. It's the story of Sarah, who is trying to adjust to life. She's in a whole new country and she's at this boarding school, and it's kind of a little bit sad, but it's also just so great. I want to rewatch the movie now, to be honest. Next is The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is a 1920s ghost story that I never would have expected to like as much as I did, but wow. I read this in 2014 and I was just instantly amazed at the way that Libba Bray wrote this story. The use of perspective is so thoughtful and everything about the story is very thought-provoking, honestly. A ghost story is the last thing I would think to include on this list. It just doesn't seem like something I would enjoy, but wow, did I ever. It's completely atmospheric and there's so many characters that you would think it would be hard to connect with all of them, but I feel a kinship with every single character. Even further into the series, I feel like I care about every single one equally, which is saying a lot. Next is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I read this in 2012 and I'm glad that I did because it was once again when I was getting exposed to reading and starting to read different books and experiment with different genres as well. And this is obviously an iconic dystopian story that I feel like I should reread soon to see if it still holds true in my heart, but I think it will because it was just very well done. Made me think about things today, which I think is the mark of a great dystopia. And the final two books are ones that I actually don't know where my copies are, so I'm going to have to get them again. But the first one is Fall of Giants by Ken Follett. I read this in 2014 and it was given to me. This is like a 1,000-page brick. It's the biggest book I think that I've ever read and I did not want to read it. I was like, no, this is so big and there's so many other books that I want to read. Ugh. But I decided to read it and I remember I was in exams. It was my first set of exams, I believe, for university and I was like, wow, I'm hooked on this story. I was like, okay, 2 more pages, and I just kept on doing that, and before I knew it, I was finished the book. So I want to finish the trilogy because it's kind of crazy that I haven't yet, knowing how much I loved that first book, but it is the first book of the Century trilogy where you follow the different generations of the same family of characters through World War I in the first book, and then World War II in the second, and then the Cold War in the final book. So I read the World War I book, and I haven't read that much World War I historical fiction, so I loved the fact that such an epic historical fiction with so many characters and taking place in all different places around Europe, you got like the whole theater of the war and it was excellent. And finally is Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer. I read this in 2012 and it tells the story of a 9-year-old boy who lost his father in the 9/11 attacks, and he ends up finding this key that his father left behind and he's trying to figure out what this key goes for and what he's supposed to do with it. So over the course of this book you follow him, and I had actually seen the movie first, but I still loved the book even more. I feel like they were both amazing stories and it definitely brought me into that child's mind, and the story went places I wasn't really expecting, but I really loved it. So those are all of my top books of the decade. Like I said, it was very hard to narrow this list down, and this is just a personal list, so they are the best books of the decade in my opinion out of what I have read. But please do let me know what your favorite books that you read in this past decade are. I can't believe that like 2020 is coming. The Roaring 20s are back, baby. But oh my goodness, we are at the end of Bookmas. What? Oh my god, I can't believe that. I hope you guys enjoyed Bookmas and these past 21 videos that I have put out for you guys. I will have the playlist linked down below if you wanted to catch up or rewatch some of your favorites. I don't know, but I'll have it linked down below. But don't worry, you will still be getting new content from me. I put out new videos every Monday and Thursday, so don't forget to click that subscribe button and then click that bell icon so you'll be notified whenever I post. I have a video going up in a day or two, I believe, because it's almost Thursday, so I will have my January TBR coming out soon. But you can also follow all of my social media, all of my handles and links and all that stuff are down below for you guys. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for keeping up with Bookmas. Thank you for everything these past, I don't know, the past decade, but I haven't been posting for a decade. But thank you for a great 2019. I hope you guys are excited for 2020. I know I am. I'm very eager to see what is going to happen because I have no clue. This past year went places I wasn't expecting, so I know next year is going to be ridiculous too, but hopefully in a good way. But I wish you guys a very happy new year and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!